All right, welcome everyone. Can we just get someone to close those doors out there? Thank you. I'm Tim Jore. I'm a strategy consultant with the Innovation Lab, and my colleague Bruce Erickson, who's I should have asked how you want to be introduced. He's an IPR specialist, copyright specialist, and we've been at the intersection of intellectual property law and missions for over 10 years, I would say. And so it's a real privilege to be here with you today. As you can see from the title, this is the messy collision of copyright law and generative AI. Anything you want to add before we get underway? Warnings, anything like that?
It's messy.
Yes, it is. All right. To begin with, get your phones out and let's see what we think we know about generative AI and copyrights. All right, scan that code. We're going to take just a very brief poll and a little quiz. And we're going to see, are we anywhere near the same page on these things? So go ahead and get that set up, get your name entered, and let's get underway. So you should see the, is that showing up on your devices? Wait for it. All right, you've got 1 minute. Actually, this one you don't. This one just fill in. We'll go to the next one. And when we start the quiz, you'll have 1 minute for each of the answers, and we'll see what we know. All right. Great. Okay. Okay, some comedians in the group. That's fantastic. Just quick show of hands. Who are the despisers of IP law that we need to know? Yeah, I knew that would be one of them. All right, let's go on to the next one. So we're into the quiz. Is it legal to create a data model trained on content without a license from the copyright owner that permits it? Yes, this is merely fair use. No, this is copyright infringement. Or things are too ambiguous to know for certain at this point. Fantastic. Sorry, we shouldn't be jumping ahead. All right, down to the last seconds. If you haven't answered, do so now. All right. Yes, this is merely fair use, got 4%, all the way out to things are too ambiguous, and lo and behold, that is the correct answer. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in the rest of our time together. Let's go to the next one. What is the copyright status of content generated by generative AI? I prompted it, I own it. I prompted it on company time, my company owns it. Or no human was involved in the creation, has no copyright. Or things are too ambiguous to know for certain at this point. Think carefully, there are vast rewards for those who win.
Are we supposed to know the answer?
I thought you had that one. Yeah. That's, All right, final answers. All right. overwhelming majority saying things are too ambiguous to know for certain at this point, but unfortunately this was a trick question. There are actually 2 correct answers. Technically, if no human was involved in the creation, it has no copyright. Again, we'll get into that. But it's also too ambiguous to know for sure if things are going to stay that way going forward. So, yeah, I forgot to mention there might be 2 correct answers. All right, last one. What is the most entertaining way to learn about copyrights and generative AI? You could wait for books to be written on the subject, then read them. You could spend your days in law association webinars and reading court filings. Do you know of anyone who does that? I know of one. He's gonna be
not the most entertaining.
Yeah, well, now you're giving them hints. Or third, you could ask your favorite large language model to give you a summary as a Shakespearean sonnet. So think carefully. Almost there. All right. Impressive. That's impressive. The unity, the sense of togetherness on this, and naturally that couldn't be anything else, right?
Tim, I will say that my wife asks me constantly, you like reading that stuff?
Yeah, I've heard that. All right. Very good. Thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause. You can put your phones away or keep them out, whatever you want. But now that we've kind of taken a look at what we think we know about this, let's in fact go to that Shakespearean sonnet generated by our good friend ChatGPT. And what's shocking to me about this is how incredibly accurate it is. Very poetic. We're not going to read the whole thing. We thought about going into like little groups where we could just discuss this together, but no. A sonnet on the tumult of AI and copyright. Just some notes here. The painter cries, "Thou thief of soul and brush." The coder claims it learns yet doth not steal. And that's actually the essence of the argument right now. Yeah. Low commons seek to guard what all may share, yet statutes lag behind the lightning's pace. That also feels very accurate. While models train on every song and face, can art be born from minds that imitate? Right? With questions written in stone and yet unknown. And we thought about just leaving it here and going early to lunch, and then we heard there was no lunch. So we're gonna press on. So, Bruce, in this messy collision, we've got some things that seem like we should be aware of them. We're gonna address this in 3 questions. And you'll see these questions are fairly far-ranging. Let's start with legal concerns. What are emerging legal concerns in the realm of copyrights and generative AI?
And you promised me my notes would show up.
It's on this one here.
There we go. The biggest concern in Gen AI is it infringing or is it against the law? And the reason that's important is copyrighted content is pivotal for training LLMs. Their performance benefits significantly from using these materials. So the question, is it against the law? You have to stop, and we're going to cover 2 things. We're not going to talk about what copyright is. You know all that. But understand when you ask the question, is it infringing, there's something you need to know about copyright and you need to know about infringing. Copyright is a modern, secular concept that is civil, not criminal law. And it simply means that the owners have a choice on whether to exploit or be generous. So if I use your copyrighted content and you don't like it, you don't go to the police and say, or the courts and say, would you bring charges against him? You have to sue me. Now that's important, and we'll talk about that later on, but it's not criminal law, it's civil law. The second thing is understand what infringing is. If you look in Black's Law Dictionary, it's going to say Infringing is a trespass of a right, particularly copyright, trademark, or a patent. We as believers understand the word trespass. If I'm generous with my content, then you haven't infringed if it's in your LLM. Proverbs 11:25, a generous person will prosper, whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. So is copyright infringing? Only if the owners say that it is, not as a matter of law. Which brings up the question, what if Christians became known as the most generous sharers of content in the entire world of content creation? So, is Gen AI copyright infringing? The opinion, there isn't an answer, depends on who's asking. The owners or the users. The owners of existing content who sell and license that content for a profit, or the users who need that content, they're creating new content and they use Gen AI as a tool. The lens you're looking through will determine your perspective.
All right, thank you. One of the things that we have found helpful is just this simple diagram that shows the three main areas where copyright infringement questions come up. So it's pretty straightforward. On the left, we have input. This is the training data, right? All the whatever formats the content is in, that goes into the model. And we're not going to go deep on this aspect of generative AI. Many here know this far better than we do. But just to keep it really simple, you've got some models that are closed. These are like paywalls, so there are certain legal databases that Bruce, in fact, uses that are, you only get access if you are paying the fee. Translation software companies build up their own models for translation. There are free ones we're all aware of, and freemium, so ChatGPT Plus, Claude, etc. And then the open source models themselves that may be redistributed. So again, all that input training data now in a model, and then the use of that, of course, in the output. And this is where things get very interesting, because the first time we put this slide together, we said this is new content, but then we added the question mark, because isn't that the point? Is this in fact new content? And how different does it have to be for it to be considered new? So let's start on the left, and this basically is the overriding question, right? Is data scraping fair use? And how do we answer that? Is there an answer for that?
Yes. The authors and owners will maintain categorically that it is not fair use, that it's infringement. The users and creators of content will maintain categorically that scraping is fair use, it's not infringement. That's what the lawsuits are all about. So you can go into layers of different lawsuits. It essentially boils down to fair use issue. There is a side one being filed regarding DMCA violations of scraping data, but largely the question about Gen AI in the courts is it fair use?
So make it real simple. Just tell us, what is the answer? The answer is?
Nobody knows.
Okay. Thanks. Now you can go to lunch.
Yet. Yes, an answer will be coming. We're similar to the early days of music streaming, where it was Wild Wild West. That eventually got solved. This will come to a resolution. I don't pretend to know what that is.
Or when, right?
Yeah, or when. Remember, as you read results of court cases right now, these court cases are very fact-specific. And so when you hear that Thomson Reuters has a win in fair use, while that's true, that is a real narrow case that applies. Now, maybe they will build, others will build on that court case. But mostly, these court cases are about preliminary injunctions. And, yeah, nobody knows.
So that's on the data input side, so the data scraping. What about on the output side? So where we have content created with or by generative AI, what factors affect infringement at the output stage?
Well, part of it is we don't know yet. But let me tell you what we do know. That if a work is a derivative, it might be infringement. No different than infringing something that is AI or just a data set. If I take a book and I want to make a movie script of that and I tell Gen AI, create a movie script of that book. It's a derivative, it's probably going to be infringement. If the output is transformative, another legal word, then fair use may apply. I take a Joel Rosenberg novel and that's in the data set, and I say, give me a theology of Joel Rosenberg's view of grace. It's going to be transformative and fair use may apply. But largely, this is working its way through the courts.
All right, so summarizing all of that and leaving you with a fun fact on that topic, did you know that totally Gen AI produced works are not copyrightable but could still be infringing?
Yep.
Isn't that fun?
Now,
so
just a real, an interesting piece on that, I think it was in January, Copyright Office came out with their latest publication about that. They actually gave a blueprint for how to beat it, how to beat the system, and how to get your work copyrighted. Essentially, the Copyright Office is saying, don't tell us, don't tell the truth, and that was a interesting approach. It's an interesting 50-page read if you like that.
Yeah, fun, and that's one of the short ones. All right, so let's move on. We looked at emerging legal concerns. What are actually some of the key court cases that are likely to shape the legal landscape in this domain?
Well, here's just a few, but let me say there's too many to count. And depending on whether you're a user or you're a content owner, your list may be different. I want to just touch on the Concord Music versus Anthropic because a ruling just came out March 25th, and that was for a preliminary injunction that Concord Music asked against Anthropic. And some interesting nuggets in there is Judge Lee in turning down and ruling against Concord said that their arguments were elusive and poorly defined. Well, what that tells me is the publishers haven't yet figured out what their arguments need to be. The case wasn't thrown out, it was just simply she didn't grant the preliminary injunction. But we put three other things up here that were fascinating from this course, or from her ruling. She said emerging technologies often test the bounds and principles of copyright law. We all know that. That's being recognized in the court. And one of the reasons that she said she's not going to give a preliminary injunction is the threshold question of fair use remains unsettled. And third, the legal rights for licensing in Gen AI have not yet been established. It doesn't mean that they won't be, but it was interesting to see this come out of the Northern District of California, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that the courts are wrestling with. This will be decided in the courts, and the courts aren't there yet. They're still wrestling with the ramifications of this.
Yeah, good. So if you've been paying attention or you're hearing it here for the first time, things are changing rapidly. There are lots of legal opinions in the lowercase sense of the term, people who think they know some things and know which way it should go. But everything is the Wild West at the moment. As you've seen, some things that our copyright law seems to not be eager to change, but we're going to figure out in the days ahead, we're going to discover how it actually applies in this world. So given that as context, You've been watching this world for a long time. What advice would you have as things continue to change as we look to the future?
The first thing I would recommend is never stop learning IP law, particularly copyright law. It's just, you will not be able to get away from it from here on out. And ignorance of IP law, ignorance of copyright in your Gen AI work is not a defense. It's a liability. Second, never stop learning IP law. This is the part we missed.
This is the part, yep.
Sorry. At least make friends with an IP attorney. They're really fun to be around if you can talk their language.
And if you buy them lunch. So most of my learning in IP, which is very, very little, but what I have learned, much of it came about from going to lunch with an IP attorney that Bruce was working with many years ago. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I wound up getting more of an education than I ever thought I needed. And man, I'll tell you, I am so grateful that I started down that path, and really helps to understand what's going on. Okay, now on to 2.
Have a designated IP member on your team who participates in all matters that you're working on. Have them there constantly. Don't bring up IP questions until you're well on down the road. That will get really expensive. That will get really messy. A few years ago, Tim and I were at a Bible translation with the Bible translation team. And a guy stood up in back after it was over during the question time. He worked for General Dynamics, and he was not an IP attorney, but he was part of the team for General Dynamics who was on their IP team. And as an engineer, it was his responsibility to sit through all of that, bring up the questions where patent law or copyright law crossed over in what they were doing with designs. Have a person on your team like that. Next, create a effective Gen AI policy that governs activity of all team members. That will protect them, that will protect you as an organization, that will protect some of the people who are inputting information into it. If you're scraping data and you scrape private information or confidential information inadvertently, now you have troubles. 4, this is a unique one, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it. A whole seminar could be on this. Learn the legal benefits of trademark law. It can provide a broader platform for content control than copyright. Copyright can't stop heresy. Trademark can keep your name from being drugged down by terrible content. Copyright control has not stopped heretical versions in English of the Bible. Since 1960, there's 60, 65, something like that, versions of the Bible that have been copyrighted. I won't mention the names of problematic ones, but there's some horrible ones out there. And not from an evangelical perspective, but just corrupt versions. So,
can I add on that real quick? One of the things that we've observed, and I know I've had these conversations with others as well, is that to the extent that the means of production increases, that is, it becomes easier for anyone to create anything, and the cost of doing so becomes too cheap to meter. The proliferation of numbers of copies of maybe they're brand new things, maybe they're derivatives, and maybe we don't even know. To the extent that that becomes our reality, the value of identity goes way up. Which content is the original? Which content was created by this entity or group of people that I trust? And how do I know that this correlates to that? This is why we think there are so many potential new technologies that could help in this. At some point, we'd like to reactivate the conversation on distributed ledgers of decentralized publishing of metadata associated with the data. It probably seems to many of us that the time is now. With the rapid proliferation happening, to find better ways to ensure that everyone is able to work together to know that they've got the content they were actually looking for. So that's all in the domain of trademark law.
Let me just say, did most of you understand what he just said?
All right, last.
This appears to have died. Ask yourself, what's a biblical basis for my actions?
Yep.
Not in my notes, but let me just, for a moment, a concern that I have is the ethics of copyright and the ramifications of copyright are not taught in our Christian universities and are not taught in our seminaries. We need to ask our questions. The question, what is the biblical basis for my actions? And then be able to defend that from Scripture.
All right, great. I want to just return to this concept, a question that I know has different ways of thinking about this. Others have explored the same idea in different ways, but what would it be like if Christians became known as very different from the typical content creation world? What if they became known as the most generous sharers of content in the entire world of content creation, particularly with our missional focus on all the way down to the last and least in thousands and thousands of languages and even language variants in multiple media formats? What would that do for the advance of the kingdom and the proclamation of the good news? So a thought to consider going forward. All right, last thought on that?
Let me just say, and
Yep.
let's hold that for a bit.
Okay.
We have quickly
Sure.
questions.
Yeah.
One of the features of the copyright law is, in theory, it incentivizes people to create. I have long held that we as believers don't need financial incentive to create. God has asked us to create. He has asked us to reach a lost and fallen world. And so our incentive is a little different. Questions?
Yeah, we tried hard to run out of time so we wouldn't have to answer questions given the nature of the topic. Unfortunately, we failed in that. Go ahead, pick someone.
So I had a question about the intersection of, like, especially minority language, data we're generating from minority language people groups, and this topic. Because it's like, I can't be free with somebody else's stuff. And we're kind of in this place where it's like, there's a socio-political, very high horsepower thing going on where people own their own data, and you can't give away their data. So how would you deal with that?
If you are in a medium to large size organization, you have counsel talk to counsel.
We do, and they tell us we don't know.
We've already decided that's our answer for everything. If we do get hit with questions, go ask your attorney.
That is a real tough issue because copyright law is remarkably similar in every country in the world. I just worked on helping people with a licensing statement for a Bible in South Sudan. They have no copyright law. And that's Wild Wild West. But no, we are responsible for the laws.
You may have answered it. I'm curious how European law might influence things. They tend to protect the artists.
That bears watching because the European legislation going on right now appears headed to a more restrictive approach. And then you have the questions, the legal questions, where was this created? Do you move jurisdiction or venue in order to, this will all be addressed. This is, at some point, you may see, depending on how the rulings are, an incredible avalanche of lawsuits. And we're not gonna let that stop Bible translation. One more, we're one more.
Okay, you guys had three in them, and you dealt with the first and the last one. You skipped the middle bit. The localized models, that's distribution. So there's a lot of tokenized content, which is copyrighted in those models being distributed without permission.
Yep.
And nobody's dealt with that in legal case law as far as I've seen.
Yeah, you're talking about the actual data in the model, and when the model then is maybe released under an open source license or pushed out there for redistribution, obviously there's some issues there. Yeah, you're right, and one of the reasons we opted to not go too deep on that is because, at least you correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but it seems like that's somewhat dependent on the first one. That is, if the inputs, if it's determined to be fair use, then this might not be the issue that we thought it is. But until we even know those answers, it's nebulous. It's even more nebulous than the first one, but they're going to
And it's really,
Well, it's way worse because the first one had the handbrakes of the online pre-prompts that manages that. But as soon as it gets into the open source, the guys are jailbreaking these things, they've got full access to it.
well, let me say that the challenge of copyright law is very fact-specific, so we don't deal in hypotheticals. And so what happens, you do an IP audit on your question, you look at every single step along the way and try to come up with an answer. We have one more, and then we have to.
I love the spirit of this, but what if you're an IP owner that monetizes your intellectual property? How do you kind of reconcile that with the spirit of that?
We're going to deal with that in the next half hour, and we're going to let people go to lunch now. It's a great question, and there are some very important answers to that, but we're never going to get to it in the 30 seconds we have left. Let me just put this on the screen. Thank you very much for being here. If you don't want to do all that heavy lifting, Bruce has a Substack that he just sends out, a curated list, updates what's going on in the courts. It's about 2 to 3 emails a month. Some of us are already on it and find it very helpful. So I'll just put that up there. Feel free to sign up for that if you would like. And thank you all. You're released to lunch.